Toronto Centre.
Speaker, I appreciate very much the opportunity to participate in this debate for many reasons, but for one reason in particular, and that is that the last time I participated in a debate in this House on the subject of the Charter was at the time of its adoption. And I think I'm right in saying that I'm the only member currently in the House who actually had an opportunity to not only participate in that debate, which I did on the question of the resolutions and motions before the House at that time, but I've also had now an opportunity to see the Charter adopted as part of our Constitution in 1982. So it is an interesting time for me to be able to respond to some of the comments that have been made by my colleagues. Some of the statements that have been made over the last while about the Charter and about the importance of the Charter and an important opportunity for us as Canadians to reflect on our Constitution, on our basic values, on our rights, on our freedoms, and yes, on our responsibilities as well. And I think that we would not be having this debate if it wasn't the case that both the Prime Minister and the newly elected member from Vaughan and others have made comments that attempt to cast a shadow on the Charter, attempt to challenge the validity of the Charter, and attempt to put our laws and our understanding of our rights and freedoms into some kind of a political quagmire where they don't belong. I particularly enjoyed listening to my colleague from Windsor. I can say to him he's sitting in the same seat from which I delivered my speech in 1981. If that gives him any comfort, and can say how much I appreciated his comments today and the very balanced way in which he made a presentation. The only disagreement I have with him is on the question of whether or not we in fact need this debate. I think Canada does need this debate and this discussion. I think we need this debate and this discussion because there's been, I think, far too much talk with far too little response about the Charter from the members of the Conservative Party, who have over the last 15 to 20 years launched a very significant broadside against the Charter and against the interpretations of the Charter that have gone forward. Now, there are some who say, well, they're not actually challenging the Charter, they're only challenging the courts. But I think for the government of the day to start attacking the courts on a systematic basis is almost as unhealthy as to say we're not going to attack the courts, we're simply going to attack the Constitution. And I do think it's important for us to understand what this new ideology that's taking shape and taking form on the opposite side, what it means and the threat that it poses to our sense of balance and to our sense of the importance of the entrenchment of rights and freedoms. That debate that took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Madam Speaker, was not something which happened out of the blue. There was a very long discussion in this country, not only about the patriation of the Constitution, about which we can continue to discuss, but also about this question of do we in fact need a Charter? Why do we need a Charter? What is it in the Canadian experience that leads us to think that we need a stronger entrenchment? Many of those arguments have been set out by my colleague from Windsor-Tecumseh, and I don't feel a compelling need to repeat them, except to make 2 points. The first one is that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was not imposed on the House by the Prime Minister of the day. It was adopted by the House. It was adopted by members of many different parties. It was debated and discussed and reviewed and analyzed by every conceivable legal group, every conceivable group in the country, looking at what this document meant. The second is that it wasn't simply an imposition of a set of rights that had never existed before. It was rather a codification of those rights. It took rights which already existed, which in many cases had already been applied by the courts, and then said, we think these rights are so fundamental that they should be entrenched and they should in fact have priority over all other legislation. Now, we all know what happened with the notwithstanding clause and the compromise that was eventually reached, but I want to just make a note that it is of great interest to me that the number of times, apart from the province of Quebec, which has its own political issues with respect to the Charter, the extent to which other provinces and provincial governments and the federal government have not, in fact, invoked the notwithstanding clause because of the value that we see in the Charter. Alors, la question pour nous, c'est...
The issue for us, therefore, is that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, what is it? It's not something that came out of the blue. It's something that came from the Canadian experience, from examples from our past, where as a country we did not always recognize the importance of fundamental rights. And there are very sad examples of this. The House is well aware of these examples, where people, for example, because of their paternity or their culture, were imprisoned. And I see my colleague from Peterborough, who is there, sitting there. He's well aware of the story of the Italians who were put into prison camps at the time of the declaration of the Second World War in 1939, and he knows well that it is a decision that we see nowadays as not having respected fundamental aspects of our Constitution. We're all aware of the example of the Japanese, and Madam Speaker, I know that in your writing and in British Columbia there were experiences that Japanese people had, that people that were imprisoned for years for no reason at all. Their land was seized. There were Canadians of Japanese descent. They didn't have the right to recognition for what happened, and it ultimately required a response from Parliament. Decades after the fact, we finally recognized the injustice of that example.
Notorious Alberta press case of the 1930s, where the Supreme Court of Canada said, actually, a province can't require newspapers to print stories that are simply favorable to the government in response to criticisms that may have been in a newspaper. The government of the day, it was the Social Credit government in Alberta, tried to impose rules and regulations on the newspapers of Alberta with respect to what they could do. Our Supreme Court said, no, actually, you can't do that. And our Supreme Court over the years, the 40s and the 50s, began making decisions that said very clearly there are rights and freedoms, there are due processes, there are things that have to be observed. But we came to the conclusion that it wasn't strong enough. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we passed a charter which gave protection to basic freedoms, gave protection to due process, rights of search and seizure, as referred to by my colleague from Vancouver Kingsway when he did his recitation and his question to the member for Windsor-Tecumseh. We saw the examples of you can't simply go in and somebody's house. You can't simply knock on the door, pick somebody up, and without having any cause. You can't. You know, there are things that have to be done, but these are not invented by the courts, nor, in fact, were they invented by the Charter. And the problem that I have with the comments made by the elected member for Vaughan, who's not yet the member for Vaughan, I think we're still allowed to say Julian Fantino. And I know Mr. Fantino very, very well. I've known him for over 25 years. And simply say that when he says, for example, who has reaped the greatest benefits from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I would argue that if it isn't common criminals, then it must be the Hells Angels. He made those comments in his book, Duty. And I would say to Mr. Fantino, what exactly is it in the Charter that you object to? Is it that there has to be due process? Is it that there have to be rights with respect, the police have to follow processes in order to carry on their work? Is it the application of law, the due process of law, to what it is that has to be done? What exactly is it in the Charter that people object to? What is it in the wording of the Charter that people say, this is wrong, the police shouldn't have to follow the law, the police shouldn't have to do this or that? I find that hard to understand, Madam Speaker, and that's why this question now becomes so important. If we take our rights seriously, we entrench them in the Constitution, which is what we did. And then we then say, once a right is entrenched, The only body in our system that can actually interpret that are the courts. We've given this job to the courts. We've said it is part of your responsibility to deal with this. So the suggestion that somehow the courts are acting inappropriately or that the courts are doing something that Parliament didn't ask them to do is nonsensical. And we're not alone in this regard, Madam Speaker. Most other countries are moving to an entrenched Bill of Rights, to an entrenched charter, a charter which looks at basic freedoms, due process, equality rights, the rights of minorities and multicultural groups, and in a Canadian context, Aboriginal rights. I want to touch briefly on each of these, Madam Speaker, in my comments. Quand on touche sur la question des
When we touch on the issue of equality rights, we have to say that a remarkable job has been done when noting that the majority does not always have the necessary sensitivity required when it comes to minorities, and that minorities that require a response that is sincere from their co-citizens, unfortunately from time to time, have had to turn to the courts in order to really have the equality that they seek and to which they have the right. We have to recognize as Canadians that our majorities have not always responded as they should have, and our equality rights remain very important to us.
I think of the enormous progress we've made as a country as a result of this dialogue and as a result of this fact that we now have the courts playing a more active role. I look at the legislation which has just been brought to this House by the Conservative Party, C-49, in which the law states boldly and bluntly there are two kinds of refugees. There are no longer one class of refugees. There are now two classes of refugees. The second class consists of those people who've come over somehow in a boat or come over in a group. And they are now to be rounded up, thrown into a detention center for as much as a year without any much of a heretofore, without a review, without anything at all. And they are to be abandoned without rights, without recourse, and to be treated completely differently from a separate class of refugees who the government has now designated in a different way. We don't think that it's only up to the courts to deal with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Madam Speaker. We think it's up to Parliament to deal with it, and that's why I'm very proud that our party has said we will not support Bill C-49 because we believe that it is fundamentally wrong in the way in which it treats people, and in particular because it doesn't pass any test with regard to this question of rights and freedoms as set out in the Charter. I would also say to you, Madam Speaker, that were it not for the Charter, were it not for the interpretation of that Charter by the courts, the First Nations people, the Aboriginal people, the Inuit and Métis people of the country would be far worse off than they are today. We tried in Charlottetown to move the political understanding forward that would allow us to recognize rights that had not previously been sufficiently recognized. But I have to say that that political effort was not successful. What we also know is that the courts have, in fact, played the role that we would want them to play in any society in saying to the majority, actually, you have to pay some attention to the treaties that you've signed. You have to recognize that once you say in your charter, once you say in your Constitution that you are going to recognize treaty rights and that you are going to recognize existing rights, then the courts have a responsibility to determine what those existing rights are. And they've taken that responsibility and taken that role, and they've taken it seriously and well. Madame la Présidente, je suis très heureux.
Madam Speaker, I am very pleased
to express my support for this very important motion tabled by my colleague from Moncton. I think it is important for Canadians to reinforce primordial ideas of our policy. That is, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's not a partisan issue. In my opinion, it certainly shouldn't be one, but unfortunately, there are still people who say, I do not accept the Constitution, I don't accept the notion of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I don't accept the responsibility that we have given to the courts to protect the rights of citizens. Because by protecting the rights of citizens, it means, or rather to protect these rights, it means that difficult decisions must sometimes be made. But this is an example of why we need such protection mechanisms.
Cases, Madam Speaker, of course there are going to be requirements sometimes that our institutions of justice and indeed even our institutions of law enforcement have to conduct themselves in a certain way in order to get to a certain result. But I think these are the protections that we require. These are not the protections that are there for any one group of people. These are the protections that are there for all Canadian citizens. And they are protections that are necessary and fundamental to our sense of what the phrase, the rule of law, means. The rule of law means respect for the law as that law is interpreted by Parliament, as it is interpreted by the courts, as it is interpreted by the legislatures. And that's the debate and discussion that we need to have. But what we don't need is this continuing fraying of the overall commitment to the importance of rights and freedoms. That is something that strikes at the heart of our national life, and that is something that strikes at the very heart of our situation. So, for example, when I hear from the Prime Minister, where he says that he agrees that there are serious flaws that exist in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that there is no review or accountability mechanisms for Supreme Court justices, what exactly is he saying? It's a fundamental principle of our democracy that the courts are independent. There is no review or accountability of the courts because that's what takes place in a dictatorship. Accountability or review of the courts, or political review or political accountability of the courts, is something that happens in countries that have no respect for the rule of law. The independence of the judiciary is a foundation of the British Constitution. It's the foundation of the common law Constitution. It's the foundation of what we need to believe in and return to our belief in as a country. So when people in the position of Prime Minister say there are serious flaws in the Charter, well, what are they? Tell us what they are. Is it due process you don't like, Prime Minister? Is it the freedom of the press you don't like? Is it the freedom of speech you don't like? Is it recognizing the treaty rights of Aboriginals? What is it? And when you talk about a review or accountability mechanism for the courts, what exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about judges who have to kowtow to the wishes of the government because you're not happy with what they do or say? This is what strikes at the heart of our Constitution. This is what strikes at the heart of our freedoms. And it's time for this kind of loose rhetoric and loose talk to come to an end. And it's time for all of us to recommit ourselves to the Canadian Constitution, to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to what that means for all of us. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I listened with attention to the member's speech. Of course, it seemed to go around in circles and not really land where I think he wanted to land. I'm wondering how he and his party square the circle when they're so insistent on rights, Canadian rights, for economic refugees that are landing on our coast uninvited, as it were. At the same time, his party stands in the way of implementing marital property rights on reserve. How does he square that circle?
The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whether I just say to the honourable member, whenever I listen to a Conservative talk about going around in circles, I'm always reminded when you have two right wings, it's impossible to go in any other direction. So, well, the member has made, has equated two things which have nothing to do with one another. First of all, the hard fact about Bill C-49, which the member can't get around, is the fact that the government has, for the first time in Canadian history, decided that they're going to just by themselves designate what kind of a refugee you are as soon as you land on the shore. The member opposite has no idea who those people are. The member opposite has no idea whether they're economic refugees or political refugees or any other kind of refugee, and neither do I. The determination process for that is a determination process that's independent of the government, it's independent of the minister, it's independent of me. You're the one who's declaring who's an economic refugee and who isn't, not me. Now, the question with Mr. Speaker, the question with respect to what are the rights or not rights on reserves is an important issue, Madam Speaker, because it touches on the issue of the connection between equality rights and the Aboriginal rights which are set out in the Charter, which is a completely separate issue.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, unlike my previous Conservative colleague, I listened attentively to my honourable colleague, and I want to congratulate him on a speech that I think was full of power, that was full of respect for fundamental freedoms and liberties in this country, and one which reminds us in this country of the absolute profound importance of rights like the right to be not detained or arrested without reasonable grounds, the right to be informed of the charges against one upon arrest, the right to retain and instruct a lawyer without delay. These are words right in our Constitution, right in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and these are the very rights that were violated en masse this summer in Toronto, which the Conservative government and members of that government shamefully refused to acknowledge or care to do anything about, instead choosing to slough it off by saying, file a complaint with the Police Complaints Commission, abdicating their roles as parliamentarians to help protect and preserve and enforce constitutional and charter rights of citizens of this country. They act like it's none of their business. They act like it's a Police Complaint Commission's job to stand up for Canadians' constitutional and charter rights, and I think it's shameful. And I'm wondering if my honourable colleague, who I know is from Toronto and probably experienced what happened this summer and knows people, if you'd care to comment on how what he saw this summer squares with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and whether or not he has any comment on this government's decision so far to not care one whit about those violations.
The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
I don't think anybody who saw what happened or who's listened to the comments and explanations for what took place in Toronto at the surrounding the events surrounding the summit could come away without being deeply troubled. And the other thing I would say to my colleague is that I don't know how the federal government can avoid its share of responsibility, because everyone in this chamber knows, and if they don't, they should know, is that all of the activities of the police with respect to the conduct of how they would manage crowds and how they would manage demonstrations was determined under the leadership of the RCMP and under the leadership of the Minister of Public Safety's department. These things do not happen. This was not some local decision taken by the Toronto Police or by the Ontario Provincial Police. It was a decision. These decisions were made from a command headquarters in which the RCMP and the Minister's office and people reporting to the Minister were involved every second of the day. So it's impossible for the federal government to say that they have no knowledge or no responsibility and have nothing to say at all about how decisions were made and how certain incidents were handled. And I think that's what's troubling me, is that we don't have the sense of responsibility that should be widely shared. And the other thing that I want to just reinforce is the comment that was made by the member from Vancouver Kingsway's colleague, who said that it's wrong to argue that it's only the courts who have responsibility for the Charter. Every single one of us has a responsibility for the Charter, Madam Speaker, and I very much appreciate the member's question.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Peterborough. You got up too late.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's interesting. I listened to the member quoted Julian Fantino's book, Duty, but I wonder if he's actually read it. I wonder if he's actually considered some of the things that are in that, some of the heartbreaking stories that are in there of a person with 42 years of service in policing, somebody that has stood up for victims and communities, somebody that's looked in the eyes of people that have committed true acts of evil and watched them walk on technicalities. That's difficult, Madam Speaker. Julian Fantino has done that, and he stood up for communities. But I want to say something about this debate today. I don't understand, at a time, this is not a big issue in my riding, and I doubt it's a big issue in the member's riding either. At a time when economies in Europe are failing, and everybody is talking about the economy and jobs and things that this Parliament should be focused on, what they should be focused on, and the Liberal Party is talking about what happened in 1982. Now, I don't think that's a platform, but maybe the member can relate why we are having this debate today when people at home have real concerns about how they're going to do things like get jobs, pay bills, and so forth. The member doesn't seem to have those concerns at all on his mind.
The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
Well, actually, Madam Speaker, I have those concerns on my mind all the time. I think the member from Peterborough knows that. I think he also knows that it's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, though. Sometimes when I listen to the answers from the members opposite in question period, I'm not always sure that that's the case. With respect to his first point, I can only say to you, Madam Speaker, and say to the honourable member, I've known Julian Fantino for a very long time, and I've read his book, and there are parts of the book that I agreed with, and there are parts of it that I disagree with. I disagree very strongly with Mr. Fantino's points about the Charter, not because the Charter hasn't sometimes been interpreted in a way that affects trials and affects the outcome of some trials, but because I think it's so wrong, fundamentally wrong, to take those outcomes, which could have happened without the Charter. I can give you lots of examples where the courts could well do these things without the Charter, and then say it's the Charter that's the problem. Whereas I think that's really where I disagree, because that then begins to undermine the public sense that the police and others fully appreciate and deeply appreciate their obligation to conduct themselves under the Constitution and under the rule of law. That's where I disagree with Mr. Fantino.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I enjoyed the intervention from the honourable member from Peterborough. I find it kind of ironic when you state that we should be talking more about jobs and the economy when and I spend a lot of time in this House debating, 70% of what we're talking about in legislation is about crime and punishment. Yeah. So what is it going to be? It's either that or it's the other thing. As a matter of fact, if he talks about we need to talk about jobs, it's very important. If I read and if I truly believe their press releases about the jobs they are creating, then it wouldn't be much of an issue, now would it? But for some reason, they keep saying that jobs are an issue. Well, great, let's get on with it. Nonetheless, I digress for only a moment. I would like to ask the honourable colleague about a program that existed that was basically a model and was claimed as a model by the United Nations, and that is the Court Challenges Program, which I'm a big fan of and unfortunately went by the wayside under this current government. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Toronto Centre has little less than a minute.
Well, just to say on the Court Challenges Program, yes, absolutely. It was fun. It has been fundamental to our approach as Liberals to say that not only do we support the Charter and the Constitution, we also support the need for people to have access to the courts so they can have their rights enforced. And that minorities who've been abandoned by the majority can have a chance to have their say in court. So yes, c'est absolument fondamental, non seulement pour les groupes minoritaires.
For the minority groups, but for language groups, it's essential to be able to have the opportunity to go before the courts to ensure that their rights are respected by our government and our legislators. It's very important for people to be able to count on that support from their government, and I'm waiting for the return of a liberal return of a Liberal government so we can reinstate the Court Challenges program.
The honourable member for Abbotsford.